On a late July evening in 2020, just as the last amber rays of sun bled through the pines of northern Maine, the town of Pine Hollow experienced something it would never be able to explain away, not fully, not ever. It began with a low diesel rumble cutting through the usual chorus of crickets and distant loons. The sound was out of place, anachronistic in a town where most traffic amounted to logging trucks or the occasional pickup heading to the bait shop. Residents near Route 17 turned from their porches, squinting into the dust kicked up by what looked, impossibly, like a school bus from another era. Not restored, not retrofitted, just worn, yellowed, its paint peeling like old sunburn, the chrome around the headlights dull and pitted. It idled for 23 minutes outside Rosie's diner, its engine ticking softly as dusk deepened. No one got off at first. Then one by one, figures emerged. 14 teenagers, 7 boys, 7 girls, and 2 adults, a man and a woman in matching forest green counselor polos with the Camp Evergreen patch stitched crookedly over their hearts. Their clothes were unmistakably early 1980s, high-waisted jeans, members-only jackets, one girl in a faded tie-dyed t-shirt that read, "Peace, Love, Pine Hollow." Their haircuts were frozen in time, feathered bangs, shag cuts, a boy with a bowl cut so precise it looked drawn with a compass. What stopped people cold wasn't just the vintage aesthetic. It was their faces, smooth, unlined, unweathered by decades. No crow's feet, no grey at the temples, no weight of middle age in their posture. They moved with the loose-limbed ease of 17-year-olds, but their eyes held a strange stillness, too calm, too watchful, as if they were observing the world through thick glass. A local mechanic, Roy Bissett, later told police he'd recognized Daniel Crenshaw immediately. Same gap between his front teeth, Roy said, voice cracking during his interview. Same freckle under his left eye. He disappeared in '80. I was at his memorial, buried an empty casket, and there he was, buying a Coke like it was Tuesday. The Pine Hollow Sheriff's Department responded, but by the time Deputy Miller arrived, the bus was gone. No tire tracks leading away. No witnesses who saw it drive off. Just the lingering scent of ozone and wet pine, and a single Polaroid left on the diner's picnic table. It showed the group standing in front of the bus, smiling politely, unnervingly in sync. On the back, in neat block letters, "We remembered to come back." The official report filed that night cited mass misperception and possible communal hysteria triggered by anniversary stress, referencing the 40th year since Camp Evergreen's closure. The Department of Transportation had no record of the bus's registration. The license plate, Maine issue, number E8024, matched a vehicle reported stolen in Bangor in June 1980 and never recovered. But the real contradiction lay in the faces, because every single person on that bus had been declared legally dead in 1982 after an exhaustive search following their disappearance during what authorities called a tragic propane leak at Camp Evergreen on August 12, 1980. 14 campers, 2 counselors, no bodies ever found. Just scorch marks near the mess hall, a collapsed storage shed, and a hastily filed incident report that smelled of bureaucratic panic. Now 40 years later, they'd returned, not as ghosts, not as bones, but as they were, unchanged, unaged, and wearing the same clothes they'd vanished in. What made it worse, what turned unease into dread, was the footage. The diner's security camera, grainy and dated, captured it all. And when analyzed frame by frame, forensic specialists noted something the sheriff's department quietly buried. None of the returned individuals cast a shadow on the asphalt, even under the diner's bright neon sign. The official story had just cracked open, and whatever slipped through wasn't human, at least not anymore. The storage unit smelled of damp cardboard, cedar mothballs, and something faintly metallic, like old coins left in a rain puddle. Elena Reyes stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed against the chill that had nothing to do with the July heat outside. Unit 317 at Pine Hollow Mini Storage had been paid for in cash every year since 1985, always on the 1st of August, always under the name M. Linhart. No forwarding address, no phone number. Just a P.O. box that closed in 1998. The manager handed her the key with a shrug. "Your uncle's stuff, huh? Weird guy, always wore those thick gloves, even in summer." Elena hadn't seen her Uncle Mateo since she was 6. All she remembered was his laugh, deep, rumbling, the kind that made the floorboards shake, and the way he tucked a sprig of pine behind her ear the last time he visited, saying, "So the forest knows your family." Then he vanished from their lives as completely as if he'd never existed. Her mother would change the subject if his name came up, eyes darting to the window, fingers tightening around her coffee mug like it might fly away. "He made a choice," she'd say, voice flat. "Some choices can't be undone." Now at 34, Elena crouched beside a dented green duffel bag near the back wall. Inside, mildewed sweaters, a fishing rod with snapped line, and at the very bottom a backpack. Not just any backpack, it was the classic 1970s Jan Sport, forest green with frayed navy straps, the kind every camp counselor carried. The zipper was stiff, but it gave with a metallic sigh. First came the schedule, laminated, slightly warped, printed on that thin, smudgy paper camps used before digital rosters. Camp Evergreen Weekly Itinerary, Week 6, July 28, August 3, 1980. Activities listed: canoeing, archery, campfire stories, talent show, but circled in red pen twice was Special Group Zone R 9 p.m. No explanation. Zone R wasn't on any public map of the camp. Beneath it, a 35mm film camera, Canon I1 lens cap missing. The film inside was still loaded. Elena didn't dare develop it yet. She'd take it to a specialist who understood chain of custody protocols. But tucked into the side pocket was what made her breath catch: a folded sheet of graph paper drawn in careful pencil. It wasn't a map of trails or cabins, it was a cross-section. A cutaway view of Camp Evergreen's lodge, showing not just the main floor and attic, but a sublevel beneath the foundation, labeled Access via Boiler Room. Arrows pointed to a room marked R, connected to a tunnel snaking toward Whisper Lake. Coordinates were noted in the margin, latitude and longitude, precise to 6 decimal places. And then, at the very bottom of the backpack, wrapped in a faded bandana printed with cartoon campfires, was a child's drawing. Crayon on construction paper, a bus, a lake, a row of stick figures holding hands. At the top, in wobbly letters, "Leo says we'll be back soon." Elena's hands trembled as she turned it over. On the reverse, in her uncle's unmistakable handwriting, the looping M, the sharp slash of his T's, was a note dated August 1, 1980. "If anything happens to me, give this to El. He'll know what to do." But Leo Mendoza, Leo Moonbeam to the campers, was one of the missing. Listed as age 13 in 1980, presumed dead. She sat back on her heels, the storage unit's fluorescent light buzzing overhead like an angry insect. This wasn't just a cold case, it was a message, a warning, and her uncle hadn't been just a counselor, he'd been a keeper of secrets. Maybe the only one who knew what Zone R really was. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her editor. "Heard about the bus sighting? You okay?" She stared at the screen, then at the map in her lap, the crayon drawing, the ghost of a boy named Leo who promised he'd return. She typed back, "I'm fine." But as she zipped the backpack closed, her fingers brushed something hard sewn into the lining. She didn't check it, not yet. She needed air, needed to think, because for the first time in decades, the silence around her uncle's disappearance felt less like grief and more like a locked room. And she had just found the key. The road to Camp Evergreen hadn't been paved in decades. What remained was a narrow logging track, choked by alder saplings and ferns gone feral, the kind of path that seemed to close behind you as you walked. Elena wore sturdy boots, her pack slung over one shoulder, the Jan Sport from her uncle's storage unit now inside it like a relic she wasn't sure she was worthy of carrying. The air grew heavier the deeper she went, less oxygen, more scent, wet earth, decaying pine needles, and beneath it, something faintly sweet and chemical, like old antifreeze mixed with burnt sugar. She hadn't told anyone she was coming, not the sheriff, not her editor, not even her mother, who'd stiffened when Elena mentioned the camp over breakfast that morning, her coffee cup rattling in its saucer. "Some places stay buried for a reason," she'd said, not meeting her daughter's eyes. The camp's main gate hung crooked on rusted hinges, the wooden sign, once bright with painted evergreen trees and the camp motto, "Where summer never ends," now bleached gray and split down the middle, as if struck by lightning. Beyond it, the clearing opened like a wound. Cabins stood collapsed or half swallowed by vines, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets. The mess hall roof had caved in, revealing skeletal rafters against the sky. But the lodge, her uncle's lodge, still stood, its stone chimney intact, the front porch sagging but defiant. Elena stepped over a fallen birch and paused. The silence was wrong, not peaceful, absent. No birds called, no squirrels chattered in the canopy. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as it moved through the trees. She pulled out her field recorder, the same model she used for oral histories, and pressed record. The red light blinked. She held it still for a full minute. When she played it back later, the audio would register only a low, subsonic hum, like a refrigerator left running in an empty house. She circled the lodge, boots sinking slightly in the loamy soil. That's when she saw it. The foundation stones near the rear entrance were discolored, not by moss, but by a fine, crystalline residue that glittered in the dappled light. She knelt, touched it with a gloved finger. It didn't crumble. It felt cool, almost greasy. She sealed a sample in an evidence vial. Then she walked toward Whisper Lake. The water was unnaturally still, its surface like black glass reflecting the overcast sky. No ripples, no insects skimming the surface. At the shore's edge, half buried in silt, something caught her eye, a camp badge, tarnished silver, shaped like a pine tree. She picked it up. Camp Evergreen Counselor 1980. The metal was warm, not sun-warmed, body-warm. She checked her watch. 3:14 p.m. The air temperature was 68 degrees F. Metal shouldn't hold heat like that unless it had been recently handled or worn. Her pulse hammered in her throat. She looked around, half expecting to see figures at the tree line, the same unaged faces from the bus. But the woods were empty. Watching, maybe, but empty. She took photos, the badge, the residue, the unnatural stillness of the lake. Then she walked the perimeter, noting where footprints might have been if anyone had come this way recently. Near a cluster of birches, the ground was softer. She crouched. Not a boot print, too small. A child's sneaker, maybe. The tread pattern matched 1980s Keds, and beside it, pressed into the mud, a single, perfect circle, as if something round and heavy had been set down briefly. A thermos, a canister. As she stood, a breeze finally stirred the trees overhead. But it didn't bring relief. It carried a sound, faint, rhythmic, like tapping or knocking, coming from beneath the lodge. Elena froze. The hum from her recorder seemed to pulse in time with it. She didn't go back inside. Not yet. She knew better than to rush a haunting. But as she walked back to the trailhead, the camp badge heavy in her pocket, she understood something with chilling certainty. Camp Evergreen hadn't been abandoned. It had been sealed. And whatever was inside hadn't stayed put. The Somerset County Records Office smelled of lemon oil and decades of dust undisturbed, a scent Elena usually found comforting, a kind of paper and ink sanctuary. Not today. Today the air felt thin, the fluorescent lights too bright, as if the building itself were bracing for what she was about to uncover. She sat at microfilm station 3, fingers stiff from the cold air conditioning, scrolling through grainy images of 1980 property filings, environmental permits, and incident reports related to Camp Evergreen. On the surface, the story held a minor propane leak in the mess hall storage shed on August 12, 1980, immediate evacuation, no injuries reported, camp closed for safety review by the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. By October, Horizon Leisure Group, the camp's parent company, announced permanent closure due to declining enrollment and infrastructure costs. But Elena had learned long ago that truth lives in the margins, in the gaps between what's said and what's filed. She pulled Horizon Leisure's payroll ledger for 1980, page after page of names, hours, deductions, until she reached August. The entries stopped abruptly on August 10, 2 days before the leak. Standard, she thought. Camp shuts down, payroll stops. But then she cross-referenced with the Social Security Death Index. 14 campers, 2 counselors, including her uncle Matteo Linhart, listed as presumed deceased in 1982 following a court petition by Horizon. Yet when she requested their final pay stubs through a public records request, a tedious dance of forms and red tape, something didn't add up. Every missing staff member had received a full paycheck dated December 15, 1980. Not a severance, not a retroactive settlement, a regular payroll disbursement with standard deductions for FICA and state tax, processed through Horizon's usual bank, First National of Portland. Elena printed the stubs, her printer humming like a nervous breath. She called the bank's historical archives, politely, persistently, and after 3 days of voicemails, a retired compliance officer named Doris agreed to speak off-record. "We kept payroll records for Horizon until '94, Doris said, voice crackling over the line. "Those December payments, they were real, drafted from Horizon's operating account. No flags, no reversals." Then came the EPA file. Officially, the DEP's 1980 inspection report cited trace levels of propane residue, no contamination of soil or water, no hazard to public health. But tucked into the archived correspondence was a sealed addendum, stamped "for internal use only," referencing a second team that arrived 3 days after the initial inspection. This team wasn't from the DEP. Their credentials listed Horizon Safety Compliance Division, but their vehicle logs showed registration to a DOD-contracted firm based in Bethesda, Maryland. The addendum noted anomalous atmospheric readings in Sector R, unidentified crystalline deposits in soil samples, and recommendation for immediate site quarantine. The document was signed by someone named Dr. Aris Thorne, whose name appeared nowhere in Horizon's employee directory. Most damning of all was the construction permit. Elena pulled the original 1972 building permit for the Evergreen Lodge. Approved, inspected, closed, but in a box marked Amendments, she found a handwritten addendum dated June 15, 1980, just weeks before the incident, authorizing substructural reinforcement and utility rerouting beneath primary foundation. The contractor listed was Veridian Engineering, a shell company that dissolved in 1983. The permit included a schematic fragment showing a reinforced concrete sublevel, accessible only from the boiler room, with ventilation shafts running directly to Whisper Lake. And then there was the NDA. Buried in the county clerk's miscellaneous agreements, from January 1981 was a 3-page non-disclosure agreement signed by the Pine Hollow selectmen, the sheriff, and the local health officer, in exchange for an anonymous community development grant of $250,000. They agreed not to discuss, disclose, or investigate any aspect of the Camp Evergreen closure beyond the official propane incident narrative. The grant was wired from a Cayman Islands account, linked to a Horizon Leisure subsidiary. Elena sat back, her neck stiff, the hum of the microfilm machine suddenly loud in the quiet room. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was a coordinated erasure, legal, financial, bureaucratic. They hadn't just hidden what happened. They paid the town to forget it ever mattered. She gathered her printouts, her hands steady now, no longer trembling. The cold case wasn't cold. It was insulated, pressurized, waiting. And the paper trail, the dry, unassailable language of bureaucracy, was screaming the truth no one had been willing to hear for 40 years. Back in her rented cabin on the edge of Pine Hollow, Elena spread the Polaroids across the kitchen table like tarot cards laid out for a reading no one wanted to hear. They'd been tucked inside a wax paper sleeve at the bottom of her uncle's backpack, curled at the edges from decades of damp. She'd taken them to a specialist in Portland, a former FBI photo analyst who now restored vintage film, and he'd developed them in a darkroom lined with lead shielding, just in case. "Old emulsion can be unstable," he'd said, but Elena knew he meant something else. Something about the way the images seemed to resist light, as if reluctant to be seen. There were 6 of them, all shot at night, all centered on the same group, the campers of Week 6, 1980, gathered in what looked like a concrete chamber lit not by bulbs, but by panels embedded in the walls, panels that glowed with a soft, blue-white luminescence, casting no shadows. The children stood in a loose semicircle, smiling. Not the easy, toothy grins of kids posing for camp photos, but something tighter, more uniform, lips stretched in identical arcs, eyes wide and fixed on the camera like dolls arranged for display. Their clothes were the same as those worn by the figures who'd stepped off the bus in 2020, tie-dye, cut-offs, those ridiculous camp-issued windbreakers with Evergreen 80 stitched in peeling thread. But it was the details that made Elena's stomach knot. In the second photo, a boy in a red baseball cap, Leo Mendoza, she was certain held a clipboard, On it, visible in the high-resolution scan, was a list of names. 14 children, 2 counselors. Herself, she noted with a jolt, wasn't on it, but Matteo Linhart's name was circled twice. Beneath the names, a column of dates. July 28, July 29, July 30, all the way to August 3. Each date had a check marker except August 4. The one was crossed out with a thick, angry X. On the back of each Polaroid, in pencil so light it nearly vanished, were names. Not just first names, full names, with middle initials, hometowns, even parents' phone numbers, written in a hurried but precise hand. Elena recognized some from old missing persons bulletins she'd studied. J.P. Calloway, Bangor, M.E., 207, 555 1103. M.R. Linhart, Counselor, Emergency Contact. Elena Reyes, B. 1986. That last one stopped her cold. Her name, written in 1980, before she was born. She cross-referenced the names with the Pine Hollow Memorial Quilt Project she'd stumbled on online, a grassroots effort by local families to honor the missing. Every name matched, every one. But one Polaroid, smaller than the others, showed something different. It depicted only 3 figures standing before a large, circular hatch in the chamber wall, a hatch marked with a faded stencil, Zone R, authorized personnel only. The man was her Uncle Matteo. The woman, a counselor named Diane Voss from the payroll records, and between them, a boy no older than 10, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear chewed off. On the back of this photo, the handwriting was different, shakier, more desperate. They're not sleeping, they're repeating, don't believe the lake. Elena ran her finger over the image of the boy. His eyes weren't smiling. They were wide with something that looked like recognition, like he knew the camera wasn't just recording, but witnessing. She spent the night cross-matching the phone numbers. Most were disconnected, of course, but one listed under EC Tran, Portland, Me still rang. An elderly woman answered on the third ring, voice thin as tissue paper. Hello, Elena introduced herself gently, mentioned Camp Evergreen. A long silence. Then a whisper, Emily Tran's my granddaughter. She vanished there, we never got her rabbit back. Elena didn't tell her about the photo, not yet. But before hanging up, the woman added, almost to herself, she used to say the lake sang to her at night, said it promised to keep her safe. Now sitting alone in the dim kitchen, Elena stared at the Polaroids pinned to the corkboard she'd set up on the wall. The campers' smiles hadn't aged, but the fear beneath them had, and it was still there, frozen in time, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough to see it. She reached for the smallest photo again, the one with the hatch. In the glow of the chamber lights just behind the trio, something shimmered on the floor, not a reflection, a puddle, and in it, faint but unmistakable, was the inverted image of a full moon, though the photo was dated August 2, 1980. That night, according to the U.S. Naval Observatory, there had been no moon at all, just a new moon, darkness. The lake hadn't kept them safe. It had kept them. The hospice wing of Pine Hollow Regional smelled of antiseptic and stewed apples, the kind of scent that clung to old grief and quiet desperation. Room 214 was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar, a faded "Do Not Disturb" sign dangling from the knob by a single plastic loop. Inside, Harold Hal Dobbs lay propped on a nest of pillows, his skin the color of weak tea, veins tracing blue rivers beneath translucent flesh. His hands, once thick with calluses from decades of wrench turning, now trembled like leaves in a breeze. But his eyes, sharp and clouded with cataracts, locked onto Elena the moment she stepped inside. "You're Matteo's niece," he said, not a question. His voice was a dry rasp, like gravel dragged over concrete. "I knew your face the second I saw you on the news, same eyes, same stubborn set to your jaw." Elena hadn't expected to be recognized. She'd only shown up after tracing a name from the payroll ledger, Harold Dobbs, listed as Maintenance, Horizon Leisure, 1978-1981. She'd assumed he was long gone, but here he was, 92 years old, hooked to an oxygen tank that hissed softly with every breath. She sat in the visitor's chair, pulling it close. "You worked at Camp Evergreen." He let out a wet chuckle that turned into a cough. "I didn't just work there, girl. I built half of it, ran the generators, patched the roofs, fixed the damn latrines when they backed up, and then I wired the thing they didn't want anyone to see." He paused, eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone to appear. They told us it was a food preservation experiment, some new way to store grain without spoilage using inert atmospheres. Bullshit. I saw the schematics. Saw the truck that came in at 3 a.m. with no plates, just black paint and DOD markings. It wasn't grain they were preserving. Elena leaned forward. What was it? Time, he whispered, or what's left of it when you pull it apart. Explained haltingly between breaths that in early 1980, Horizon Leisure, under contract with a shadowy Pentagon division called Chronos Applications, installed a prototype temporal stasis field generator beneath the camp lodge. The core used resonant quartz crystals mined from a site near Whisper Lake, charged with low-frequency pulses that in theory could slow molecular decay to near zero. They needed test subjects, Hal said, his voice dropping even lower. Not volunteers. Subjects' kids were ideal, clean systems, high brain plasticity, no pre-existing conditions. They told parents it was a gifted enrichment program. Free tuition, all expenses paid, isolated location for focus. Elena's blood ran cold. The campers weren't missing, Hal finished. They were paused, trapped in a loop, 24-hour cycles. Every night at 9 p.m. the field would reset. They'd wake up thinking it was the same day, over and over. The counselors were supposed to monitor vitals, log behavior, report anomalies, but something went wrong. The field destabilized, started leaking. The lake, it absorbed the energy, became a kind of anchor. That's why they're tied to it. He reached for a glass of water with a shaking hand. Elena handed it to him. Your uncle figured it out, Matteo. He tried to shut it down, said the kids weren't just repeating, they were fraying, losing pieces of themselves each cycle. He was going to blow the whistle, then poof, gone. Elena swallowed, and the bus in 2020. Hal's eyes glistened. The field collapsed, or maybe it finally let go, but if they came back unchanged, that means the loop's broken, but the stasis isn't. Time's catching up to them now, and it doesn't like being cheated. He gripped her wrist suddenly, surprisingly strong. Don't go back alone. They're watching. Horizon's gone, but the people behind it, they're still out there, and they don't forget loose ends. Before she could ask more, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Hal's grip loosened. He sank back, his face slackening. Tell Matteo, I'm sorry I didn't help him, he murmured, already drifting. Tell him the lake remembers. Elena left the room, with the weight of that warning pressing into her ribs like a stone. Outside, the late afternoon sun glinted off the hospital's windows, but she felt no warmth, because Hal Dobbs hadn't just confirmed a conspiracy. He'd given her a countdown. And somewhere beneath Whisper Lake, time was starting to run out, for all of them. The email arrived at 3:17 a.m., subject line blank, sender field a string of random characters. X7K9Q2 at MLD Secure Net. Elena had been asleep on the couch, the Polaroid spread across the coffee table like a shrine, when her laptop chimed, a soft, innocent sound that now felt like a tripwire snapping. She opened it with one eye still crusty from sleep, expecting spam. Instead, a single PDF filled the screen. A letter on Department of Defense letterhead, stamped unclassified FOUO, for official use only. It was a press statement, dated that very morning. The Department of Defense is aware of recent social media activity concerning alleged sightings of individuals from Camp Evergreen in Pine Hollow, Maine. It began clinical and cold. After review, these reports are assessed as a case of mass psychological convergence, commonly known as collective false memory, potentially exacerbated by the 40th anniversary of the camp's closure and local folklore. The bus in question has been identified as a vintage vehicle used by a theatrical reenactment group based in Vermont, whose members inadvertently entered private property while scouting filming locations. No persons matching the descriptions of the 1980 missing have been verified. The DoD has no historical or operational connection to Camp Evergreen or its parent company, Horizon Leisure Group. Attached was a grainy photo of a group of young adults in 1980s costumes standing beside a similar, but not identical, bus outside a community theater in Burlington. Their faces were blurred, their camp patches generic. It was a clumsy forgery. The bus lacked the distinctive dent on the rear fender Elena had noted in the diner's security footage. By dawn, the statement was everywhere. Local news outlets ran it verbatim. Social media threads mocking Pine Hollow's ghost campers trended regionally. Even the Portland Press-Herald published a half-skeptical, half-dismissive piece titled Nostalgia or Delusion, Town Grapples with Bizarre Bus Sighting. Then came the phone call. A research grant from the Northeast Historical Preservation Consortium was indefinitely suspended due to budget reallocation. No explanation, just a polite voicemail from a program officer she'd known for years, his voice tight, apologetic, but final. That afternoon, returning from the post office, she found her cabin's back door slightly ajar. Nothing was stolen. Her laptop sat untouched on the desk. But her filing cabinet, the one holding the original Polaroids, the camp map, the cassette tape, had been opened, not forced, picked with precision. The documents were still there, but rearranged. The microcassette labeled Final Log, Leo, was missing. 2 days later, a courier in a plain gray uniform delivered a manila envelope with no return address. Inside, a small Ziploc bag containing damp soil, black, silty, unmistakably from the shore of Whisper Lake, and a single sheet of paper. No watermark, no letterhead, just 3 lines of text, typed in Times New Roman, 12 point. You have seen enough. The dead do not speak. Let them rest. Beneath it, a single fingerprint in black ink, too perfect to be accidental. A message, not a mistake. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table staring at the soil sample, a black SUV with tinted windows idled at the end of her gravel drive for 47 minutes. No plates. When she stepped onto the porch with her phone raised to record, it pulled away silently, tires barely crunching the stones. Then came the visit. Agent Daniel Rourke of the Department of Homeland Security arrived at noon 2 days later, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than her monthly rent and a smile that never reached his eyes. He didn't flash a badge. He didn't need to. He knew things: the name of her childhood dog, the fact she'd failed her driver's test twice, the exact date her mother stopped speaking to her uncle. "We're not here to threaten you, Ms. Reyes," he said, standing just inside her doorway, careful not to cross the threshold completely, an old trick she knew, to avoid implicating himself in any potential unlawful entry. "We are here to protect you from yourself." He spoke of national security, of legacy programs with modern sensitivities, of unintended consequences when historical narratives are distorted by personal grief. He never denied the existence of Zone R, he never confirmed it. He simply implied that pursuing it would not only be futile, but dangerous, to her mother, to anyone who'd ever shown her kindness in Pine Hollow. Some doors, he said, adjusting his cufflinks, were sealed for a reason, not to hide the truth, to contain it. He left without another word. That night, Elena packed a go bag, hard drive, passport, cash, the soil sample, the camp map. She drove to a 24-hour copy shop in Bangor, made 3 encrypted backups of everything, and mailed them to trusted colleagues under false names. She knew then that she wasn't just investigating a cold case anymore. She'd become a liability. And in the world of institutional silence, liabilities don't get answers. They get erased. It was the lining of the backpack that gave it away, not frayed from age, as she'd first assumed, but deliberately stitched shut with thread that didn't match the rest of the fabric. Elena had noticed it during her 3rd inventory of the contents, fingers tracing the interior seam near the bottom compartment. Something was rigid underneath, flat and thin, resisting the give of the canvas. She'd almost missed it, distracted by the Polaroids and the map, but now, alone in the back room of a discreet audio restoration studio in Portland, her 3rd relocation in as many weeks, she sat with a pair of surgical scissors and steady hands, cutting just enough to peel back the fabric without damaging what lay beneath. Out slid a microcassette, the kind used in pocket dictaphones in the late 70s and early 80s, its plastic casing yellowed but intact. Scrawled in her uncle's hand on a strip of masking tape, "Final Log, Leo." Her breath caught. This was the tape the intruder had taken from her cabin, only it hadn't been taken at all. Mateo had hidden a second copy, or maybe the first had never left his possession. Either way, it was here now, in her palm, cool and humming with potential. The studio owner, a retired sound engineer named Marlowe who'd worked on declassifying Cold War intercepts, set up a reel-to-reel transfer rig with noise reduction filters and spectral analysis software. Old tapes like this, he murmured, threading the microcassette into an adapter, they don't just degrade, they absorb atmosphere, humidity, static, sometimes things that shouldn't be there. He didn't look at her as he said it, but she heard the implication. When he pressed play, the room filled with the soft hiss of dead air, then a voice. August 2, 1980, 11:47 p.m. This is Matteo Linhart, Camp Evergreen head counselor, final entry. Her uncle's voice, deeper than she remembered, strained, like someone holding back a scream. The field activated at 9:03, standard reset, but something's wrong. The kids, they're not waking up right. Leo keeps asking if today is still Tuesday. I told him yes, again, but he looked at me like I'd betrayed him, like he knew. Diane thinks it's stress, but I've been checking the logs. The quartz array's output is spiking, not stable sine wave, chaotic bursts, like it's feeding off something. A pause, heavy breathing, then a child's voice, distant but clear. Uncle Matteo, is the lake singing tonight? Matteo, softer now, go back to sleep, Leo, it's just the wind. But the wind wasn't what followed. In the background, a low harmonic drone began, a sound that made Marlowe frown and lean closer to the speakers. That frequency, it's not natural, not mechanical either, it's resonant, like crystal under pressure. Then chaos. Shouting, a woman's voice, Diane yelling, shut it down now, metal clanging. A child crying, not in fear but in confusion. Why am I here again? I was just here. And then Matteo, desperate, almost sobbing. The field's looping us too. I saw myself outside the chamber window. Yesterday's me, watching today's me. It's folding time in on itself. We're not sleeping, we're repeating. And the lake is holding the overflow. Static crackled. A high-pitched whine pierced the recording. Then, eerily calm, Matteo again. If you're hearing this, tell my sister I'm sorry. Tell her I tried to get them out. But time doesn't let go once it's got you, and it's got us. The tape ended with a child's voice, clear as glass, whispering, we'll be back soon. Silence. Marlowe rewound the tape, ran a spectrogram. That whisper at the end, he said slowly, it's not on the same audio layer. It was recorded over the silence after the main session. And the voice, it's not a child's vocal cords. The harmonics are off, too pure, like it was synthesized or filtered through something. Then he isolated the background drone during the chaotic segment. Listen. He played it again, this time filtered to remove human voices. Beneath the clatter and cries, a rhythmic pulse emerged, steady, slow, almost like a heartbeat. That's not machinery, that's water. Specifically, shallow water resonance, like waves lapping against a hollow chamber. Whisper Lake. Elena sat numb, the recording playing on loop in her mind. It wasn't just a log. It was a confession, a warning, and a time-stamped proof that the official story, the propane leak, the accidental evacuation, was a lie wrapped in bureaucracy and buried under 40 years of silence. But the most chilling detail wasn't in the words. It was in the metadata. Marlowe ran the tape stock through a chemical age test. This was manufactured in late 1979, he confirmed, and the magnetic signature matches batch numbers used by Horizon Leisure's corporate offices in 80. The recording was real. And if her uncle was telling the truth, if they'd been trapped in a time loop since August 1980, then the campers who stepped off that bus in 2020 hadn't just returned unchanged. They'd never left. The night air over Camp Evergreen bit, with the kind of damp cold that seeped through layers, the kind that made your bones ache before your skin even registered the chill. Elena crouched behind a thicket of alders, her breath misting in the beam of a red-filtered headlamp, watching the geologist, Dr. Aris Chen, no relation to the mysterious Dr. Thorne from the EPA file, calibrate the ground-penetrating radar unit near the lodge's collapsed porch. They'd come under cover of a moonless sky, dressed in dark, non-reflective clothing, with comms earpieces set to silent vibration. No drones, no flashlights, just patience, precision, and the unshakable dread that they were being watched. Aris had been skeptical at first. Temporal stasis, wasn't exactly in the Geological Society's handbook, but when Alina showed him the concrete stamp discrepancy, the anomalous soil samples, and the spectral analysis of the lake's resonance, his professional curiosity had tipped into grim fascination. Even if the physics are impossible, he'd said, the evidence of something anomalous is real, and real things leave traces. The radar pinged softly every 3 seconds, sending pulses into the earth. On the screen, a ghostly cross-section of the subsurface scrolled past, tree roots, old septic lines, the lodge's foundation, and then at 12.7 feet below grade, a perfect cylindrical void 20 feet in diameter, with walls too smooth, too uniform to be natural. That's not a root cellar, Aris whispered, zooming in. That's engineered. And the material, it's reflecting like quartz composite. They moved to the coordinates from the hand-drawn map, just east of the boiler room foundation. Alina cleared decades of leaf litter and rotted timber with gloved hands, heart hammering against her ribs. Then she saw it, a rusted iron ring set into a concrete slab, almost flush with the ground, camouflaged by moss and time. She tugged. Nothing. Aris knelt beside her. Running a magnetometer over the surface. There's a locking mechanism beneath, electromagnetic, but the power's been off for decades, unless... He pulled a handheld M-pulse generator from his pack, a device originally designed to reset jammed industrial valves. One shot. If it's still wired to a failsafe, this might trick it into thinking main power's restored. He pressed the trigger. A low thrum vibrated through the earth. The iron ring clicked. Together they heaved. The slab lifted with a groan of stressed metal and grinding stone, revealing a vertical shaft lined with riveted steel plates. A ladder descended into absolute blackness. The air that rose from below carried that same sweet chemical odor Alina had noticed on her first visit, but stronger now, laced with ozone and something else, the sterile tang of old hospital corridors. They clipped into harnesses, headlamps cutting cones of white light into the void. The descent took 90 seconds. At the bottom, a circular chamber unfolded around them, silent and humming with residual energy. The walls were lined with hexagonal panels of smoky quartz, each etched with faint geometric patterns that seemed to shift when stared at too long. In the center stood 16 cylindrical pods, cryochambers, though unlike any Alina had seen. Translucent lids, frosted with age, each marked with a nameplate, Leo Mendoza, J.P. Calloway, Diane Voss, and near the far wall, Matteo Linhart. All but one were sealed. The 16th pod, Leo's, stood cracked open from the inside, its lid shattered outward as if something had pushed through with desperate strength. Glass shards glittered on the floor like frozen tears. Inside, the padding was stained with something dark and dried, blood or residue, Alina couldn't tell. Strapped to the inner rim was a small, rusted emergency beacon, its LED long dead. Aris knelt beside it, scanning with a handheld spectrometer. This isn't standard issue. It's military-grade, designed to emit a homing pulse in temporal displacement scenarios, but it's never been activated. Someone disabled it. Alina moved to the control console near the chamber wall. Dust coated the switches and dials, but one screen, powered by a hidden battery backup, still glowed faintly green. It displayed a countdown, 000000. Below it, a log entry, loop TIA-ATD, subjects ILEACD, field collapse imminent. Then, without warning, the chamber lights flared. Not from the quartz panels, from the PA system embedded in the ceiling. A burst of static, then a voice, Alina's own, crackled through the speakers. And we're live from the sublevel beneath Camp Evergreen, where we believe we've uncovered proof of a 40-year cover-up. She froze. That was her voice, from the live stream she'd planned for next week. But she hadn't gone live yet. Aris looked at her, eyes wide. They're broadcasting us, right now. Above them, the hatch slammed shut with a metallic boom. And from the direction of Whisper Lake, a low, rhythmic tapping began, just like the sound on the drone footage from Section 1. Only this time, it wasn't coming from inside the silo. It was coming from the pods. One by one, their lids began to vibrate. The journal lay half-buried beneath a tangle of frayed wiring and shattered glass near Leo's open pod, its leather cover warped by decades of damp but still legible. Elena picked it up with gloved hands, the pages stiff as parchment, and flipped it open under the beam of her headlamp. Most of the entries were mundane: camp schedules, supply orders, notes about a camper's homesickness, but the margins told a different story. There, in tight, frantic pencil script that grew increasingly jagged with each passing day, Matteo Linhart had documented the unraveling. Early entries were clinical: field activation successful, subjects report no discomfort, sleep cycles normal, Diane notes slight disorientation upon waking attributed to isolation. But by July 30, the tone shifted. Leo asked if his mom got his letter, told him yes. She never did. We don't send mail out during the loop. He cried for an hour. I held him, felt like lying to a ghost. A sketch filled the margin of August 1, an hourglass, but the sand wasn't falling. It was swirling in a vortex, caught between the bulbs. Beneath it, an equation that made Elena's head ache just looking at it: partial derivatives, quantum symbols, the Greek letter tau repeated like a mantra. On the facing page, a list titled Anomalies. Time bleed, heard tomorrow's rain today. Reflections, moving independently. Lake surface, showing wrong season. My shadow, lagging 2 sec behind. The final entry, dated August 2, was barely legible, the pencil pressed so hard it tore the paper. We're not resetting, we're fracturing. Each loop we lose a piece: memories, sensations, names. Tian forgot her daughter's birthday. Leo doesn't know what tomorrow means anymore. The lake is the only thing holding us together. It absorbs the time spill, but it's filling up. Soon it'll overflow, and when it does, we'll scatter like ash. Beneath that, in a different hand, smaller, rounder, unmistakably a child's, was a single line: don't let them wear our faces again. Elena's breath hitched. She'd seen those words before, not in writing, but in the way the campers had stood at the diner in 2020, too still, too synchronized, their smiles just slightly off, like mannequins dressed in human skin. She turned the page. On the back cover, tucked into the binding, was a folded slip of thermal fax paper, its edges browned with age. It was a printout from the chamber's internal log, dated August 2, 1980, 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes before the tape ended. System alert. Temporal coherence below 40%. Subjects exhibiting CHRNO fracture symptoms. Recommend termination protocol theta. User input DNID. Reason ethical override MLINHART. Below that, scrawled in Matteo's hand, I won't let them erase you, even if time does. Elena looked up from the journal, her eyes scanning the chamber. The quartz panels hummed faintly, their inner light pulsing like slow breaths. The other pods remained sealed, their occupants frozen in stasis, but were they still in there, or had the loop's collapse scattered them across time, leaving only echoes behind? She thought of the bus in 2020, the unaged faces, the lack of shadows, the Polaroid left behind. It wasn't a return, it was a residue, a final imprint released when the field gave way. And if the journal was right, the real campers, their consciousnesses, their souls, hadn't come back at all. What stepped off that bus was what remained after time had chewed them down to symbols, names, clothes, gestures, hollow shells wearing familiar skin. And someone, or something, had sent them as a message. She closed the journal, its weight heavier than stone. In that moment, she understood the true horror wasn't that they'd been trapped in time. It was that they'd been forgotten by it. And the only thing left to do was make sure the world remembered what had been taken. A year after the lake took them back, the people of Pine Hollow gathered not in anger, not in fear, but in quiet remembrance. The site of Camp Evergreen had been declared a federal historical preservation zone, not for its architecture, but for its truth. Fences now encircled the excavation, not to keep people out, but to honor what had been unearthed. And at the edge of Whisper Lake, where the trees met the water, a new tradition had taken root. They called it the Quilt of Names. Stitched over 8 months by hands both old and young, grandparents who'd lost grandchildren, teenagers who'd only known the story through whispers, even a few outsiders who'd driven hours just to add a square. It hung now in the Pine Hollow Community Library, stretched across a reclaimed barn wall under soft, archival lighting. Each of the 16 panels was unique. A patch of denim from 1980s jeans, a scrap of tie-dye, a snippet of counselor's green polo. One square held a tiny stitched rabbit, its ear frayed just like the one Leo had carried. Another bore a compass rose, needle pointing always toward the lake. Elena stood near the back of the room during the dedication, not wanting to draw attention, but Martha Ellsworth, whose grandson had been a camper in '79 and who'd broken the town's silence, spotted her and pulled her forward. "You gave them back to us," she said, pressing Elena's palm to the quilt. "Not their bodies, but their names, their stories, that's what lasts." Elena's own square was last in the row. She'd cut a shard of quartz from one of the chamber's fractured panels, a piece no larger than a thumbnail, and wrapped it in red thread, stitching it into a field of deep indigo fabric. Around it, in fine embroidery, she'd written, "They were here, they are remembered." After the ceremony, as dusk settled over the town, Elena walked alone to the lake. The air was warm, birdsong finally returned to the trees, the water lapping gently against the shore. She sat on the same spot where she'd found the camp badge, now marked with a small bronze plaque, in memory of the 16. August 12, 1980, August 12, 2021. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The wind carried the voices of children from the playground down the road, real children, alive, laughing. For the first time in decades, the silence around Camp Evergreen wasn't empty. It was full of acknowledgement, full of grief that had been allowed to breathe. On her way back, she passed the old diner. Rosie's had closed, but the building remained, its sign repainted with a new motto, "Where truth finally rests." Inside, through the window, she saw the original picnic table, the one where the Polaroid had been left, now preserved under glass, part of a small exhibit about Pine Hollow's Summer of Reckoning. Elena paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. She thought of her uncle Matteo, who'd chosen truth over silence, even when it cost him everything. She thought of Leo, who'd asked for the sun one last time. She thought of all the names that had been buried under bureaucracy and fear, and how, against all odds, they'd been pulled back into the light. She wasn't a journalist anymore, not really. She was a keeper now, a witness who refused to look away. And as she turned to leave, the first fireflies of the season blinked into life above the grass, tiny, fleeting points of light, rising from the earth like memories refusing to fade. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October, slipped between the pages of a manila envelope, containing the final inventory of her uncle Matteo's recovered effects, items the federal archivists had deemed of no ongoing investigative relevance. It was thin, brittle paper, the kind used in typewriters before digital correspondence, folded once and sealed with a dot of dried red wax that bore no imprint. The postmark, however, was the real impossibility. Stamped August 4, 1980, in Pine Hollow, Maine, 2 days after the loop collapsed, 2 days before the official accident report was filed. Yet it hadn't been delivered until last week. The postal tracking code, when Elena looked it up, showed it had been in transit for 41 years, routed through a series of defunct regional sorting facilities before finally being flagged as undeliverable and forwarded to her current address as next of kin. Her name was typed on the front in clean, institutional font, Elena Reyes, no title, no return address, just her name, as if the sender had known she would exist long before she was born. She opened it with gloved hands, as though handling evidence, which in a way it was. Inside, a single sheet of the same brittle paper, no salutation, no signature, just one sentence, typed in the same precise font. "Check Camp Cedar Ridge." That was all. No explanation, no warning, no plea, just 5 words, echoing down 4 decades like a stone dropped into a well. She sat at her kitchen table in the cabin she now called home, a place she'd bought with the advance from her book deal, The Loop, Truth and Time at Camp Evergreen, and stared at the sentence until the letters blurred. Cedar Ridge. She'd never heard of it, but a quick search showed it existed. A decommissioned summer camp in northern Vermont, shut down in 1983 under similarly vague circumstances, structural instability, according to local records. Owned, she discovered with a chill, by a shell corporation linked to Horizon Leisure Group. She pulled out the 1979 New England summer camp directory she'd acquired during her early research. Flipping to the Vermont section, she found it, Camp Cedar Ridge, nestled in the Green Mountains near Lake Willoughby, and there, circled in faint red pencil, so light she almost missed it, was the name. The handwriting matched her uncle. But that wasn't what made her breath stop. Tucked into the back of the directory, unnoticed until now, was a hand-drawn map of the Northeast. Not roads, not towns, but lakes, 6 of them scattered across Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York, each marked with a small red X. Whisper Lake was one, Cedar Ridge's lake was another. The others had no names, just coordinates, and in the margin, in Mateo's familiar script, "They're still breathing." Elena rose and walked to the window. Rain had begun to fall, soft and steady, drumming against the roof like a heartbeat. She thought of the quartz shard in her quilt square, the way it caught the light even in shadow. She thought of the tapping from the sealed shaft, the children's voices on the cassette, the way the campers had walked into the lake without looking back. This wasn't over. It had never been just about Camp Evergreen. It was a network, a chain of sites, each anchored to a lake, each built over the same buried secret. And if Cedar Ridge was still out there, untouched, uninvestigated, then whatever happened at Evergreen might still be happening, or worse, it might be waiting to happen again. She packed a go-bag that night. The map, a fresh voice recorder, her uncle's Jan Sport backpack, a vial of Whisper Lake water, and the letter, folded carefully, sealed once more in its envelope. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. Not yet. Some truths needed to be walked toward alone. As her truck pulled onto Route 2 the next morning, rain streaking the windshield like tears, she glanced in the rearview mirror. For a second, just a flicker, she thought she saw a school bus in the distance, idling at the edge of the pines. But when she turned to look, the road was empty. Only the rain remained. And the road ahead, stretching north into the mist.